Though the animalian nervous system is somewhat modest in its molecular variety, its subsequent evolution has nevertheless brought forward an untold wealth of diversity, an inexhaustible variance that has granted each individual their own unique view on the world. For example, the highly complex system of the octopus can be guided by some 9 interconnected brains, 1 centralized and 8 more located within each of their 8 tentacles. Some spider brains will even be branched out into their feet, whilst a leech's internal structure is divided into 32 segments, each governed by one of its 32 brains. But if the nervous system is thought to be that which connects us to the world, then is this wealth of variety not problematic? Since if we do choose to accept the commonly agreed upon proposition that the universe can only conjure consciousness via what we would consider a recognizable nervous system, shouldn't we also note just how little common ground there is between each conscious experience generated? Thus leading us to the question, what exactly is the world that a nervous system gains access to? So join me as I attempt to unpick the infinities of what is. Think about the room you are in right now. How many entities are sharing this space with you? Perhaps you're listening to this on a train, in a cafe, or at home alone. Maybe you're lying in bed next to your spouse. You might even have a pet in the room. Regardless, there are potentially thousands of these little sense-wielding creatures hidden just outside of view. Countless insects hiding in the high corners or behind those things that rarely get moved. That tiny spider hunting silently above your head. Or even the unseen minuscule mites that were born to live, reproduce and die on your face. Not to mention the 37 million bacteria you've exhaled over the last hour. That room, that same spatio-temporal reality is concurrently being interpreted by a menagerie of unique life forms, each capable of translating its surroundings into a distinct version of experience. And so the question, now worth asking, is which of these systems gets closest to the truth? Which of the many nervous systems operating in that one room allows its owner to perceive the most reality? They're also very different. Not only due to the endless diversity of neuronal systems, nor even their disparate locations within the environment, but also down to the fact that their very senses can be entirely particular to their species. Be it access to differing bands of light, sound, or even a varied influence of gravity, all of which would have us thinking we were on some strange alien planet. Add to that their social norms, which not even after 1 million years of study could we ever truly comprehend. And finally is the intimate, subjective translation of environment and self, all of which result in a singular experience of being. A state of mind so foreign to our experience that it surpasses even imagination. Countless senses, all tuned to prioritize information that we, with our superior intellect, simply fail to notice. Inasmuch as if we were to claim even a single attribute of human consciousness as universally superior, in terms of it being an accurate translation of reality, we would still be forced to consider the collective superiority in respect of those aspects we miss. Because while we may host certain cognitive privileges, we shall always miss something that they do not. Thus, The claim that all expressions of consciousness fail in this same way seems undeniable. Each complex only conjures an infinitely incomplete yet perfectly valid experience of reality. An experience built upon the merest sliver of vibrational interference. An experience particular to that body and its unique capacity for interaction. An experience that must move otherwise blindly through whatever it is that this deeper reality might happen to be. So, with this in mind, I want you to imagine an infinite desert. And within this endless landscape, imagine that certain grains of sand are light and others are dark. So that as this is an infinite desert, we must also imagine that it contains all possible finite arrangements of those dark and light grains. Thus, we might further envision how merely by chance the lighter grains have arranged themselves into a stunningly beautiful, highly detailed geometric shape in one special location. Now, out of this desert, a creature has evolved, whose senses only allow her to perceive the lighter grains of sand, and as such, she only experiences the striking shape. She knows of no desert. As far as she is concerned, the mesmerizing shape floats upon an ocean of total emptiness. Now, if this creature were intelligent enough, she could still deduce much about this shape. She might even trace its history to a point where she could even theorize an origin. The fact is, she could do all of this while remaining entirely unaware of those darker grains. And though the shape is technically real from within her perspective, we, as outside observers, must also appreciate that it does not exist in any ultimate sense beyond her observation. Because if there were another creature whose evolutionary path had enabled it to see no difference between the light and dark grains, then the shape and its history would lose all relevance. Though its structure is not necessarily an illusion, the story of the lighter grains are nonetheless engulfed by the more complex story of the surrounding desert. What this coarsely demonstrates is that we can never be entirely sure of what information we aren't being made privy to, nor what aspects of reality exist beyond our senses. But it gets weirder, because as the desert is infinite, there would inevitably have to be an infinite repetition of this pattern, as well as an infinite series of similar geometric shapes. Though even if our first creature could know in some way beyond our reasoning of the entire infinite collection of light-grain shapes, there would still be an infinite number of unknowns remaining. The point here is that even after we have access to an infinity of information, we may still be infinitely unaware. Though it also shows how we are able to build coherent stories about structures in our world, which may offer relative truths, even if, in actuality, the structure itself has no absolute identity beyond the subjective abstraction. In short, where we are denied absolutes, we are granted the relative. So how can our understanding of the nervous system help us understand what consciousness misses, and therefore what consciousness is? Instead, I now want you to try and imagine something a little more abstract. Consider each and every one of those conscious beings that are sharing their room with you at this very moment. And then, imagine a blending of their perceptions, a godlike, omnipresent view of your room that taps into the visual cortex of every animal in the same way that one would hack a set of security cameras. Then build these perspectives into a combined holographic view of your room. Now remember, Each set of eyes sees light differently, so even a blending of the many variants of sight alone would be an alien experience. But now, imagine every expression of every sense. Every touch, sight and sound felt through the sole perceiver. In some places, the input from these experiences might double up, enhancing the strength of that particular wave function. Or in other areas, this wave function of awareness may provide lower energies due to the existence of reasonably unique traits of perception. And potentially there could even be places where the input from these varied perspectives just cancel one another out. Like the hollow sound that occurs when two polar sound waves of equal energy meet mid-air to create a standing sound wave. But regardless of this mess, try to consider it as a totality, and then add to it the vast array of mental abilities, thoughts, understandings, intentions, and experiences of each self as they are felt by the room's collective. The totality of the collective qualia superimposed into one unified experience. This, my friends, is the conscious reflection of your room. Something that does actually exist. An overwhelming holographical world of sense, as created by the many variants of the earth-born nervous system, all sharing an abstracted moment in space and time. But what if we now expand things even further, from the blended perceptions of a few thousand entities living in your room, to all consciousness ever to have been shaped by this reshuffling of the nervous system? A grand, encompassing perspective, revealing all that the nervous system has ever been able to offer, once again conceived through the sole impossible experiencer. And let us not forget those perspectives revealed by foreign nervous systems, those which have evolved down biologically unfamiliar paths as did the ctenophores. On and on, combining as we go, each story, each reshuffle of the genetic dice, each time gaining those few rare handfuls of pixels that collectively add up to this ever-enhancing picture of conscious reality, as it has been and as it is, as the reshuffling continues, ever evolving into new and more complex systems, as it moves along the ever-shifting boundaries of consciousness. And now, in stark contrast, let us humbly return to our own personal perspective, where hopefully we can begin to see ourselves through new eyes. Eyes that can now appreciate how extremely limited our highly intellectual perspective is. But not only that, moreover, might it also offer us a new way of thinking about consciousness and its place within the world, in terms of the extent to which living consciousness has thus far reached, and equally, how limitless the unknown side of reality must be if it is to allow for this never-ending unfold of variety. The perceived in its harmony with the imperceivable. It's an interesting and enjoyable thought process to play with. Though funnily, I am also critically aware of just how impossible it is to imagine those things I've just asked you to imagine. Indeed, it is perhaps the most impossible thing to imagine by its very nature. Though what's curious about the way we each continued in our attempt was that, rather than merely failing to visualize the scenario and giving up mid-meditation, we instead chose to imagine that we could imagine it, and thus pretended to do so. We imagined that we could imagine that which was unimaginable. Which only goes to show how, when we try to visualize foreign perspectives, we often ignore the regions where a lack of experience or understanding holds. Amid those darker grains, where only blanks are to be found, do we pretend for the sake of the thought experiment, as Modern neuroscience has come to show our minds are far more concerned with locating phenomena that contradict our assumptions rather than inquiring into the environment itself. We don't see the world. We presume the world and then check to see if our presumptions align with the input received. But therefore, what is missed remains missed. And so, as a practice, you might think that in terms of helping us to understand an abstract phenomenon like consciousness, imagining that we can imagine something is likely only to lead to deeper and deeper illusions, though it may not be as useless as it first sounds. Just as the creature in the infinite desert could produce a posteriori truths about an object that only existed relative to her subjective reality, likewise, when we allow ourselves to imagine ideas and structures that fall beyond our experience, it's just as possible to deduce certain a priori truths relative to it. For example, one could confidently state that if given that this holographic collective consciousness was real, then we could at very least know that it would be a wholly unique perspective, an entirely original view of reality, one that could be considered as valid an interpretation as any other, since none of its vibrational input could ever be claimed false, nor independent of living interaction. Just as when stacking exposures of red, green and blue film, will the collective offer us a unique perspective, the full colour image. But note that in doing so, the full colour image has begun to ignore certain truths of the monochromatic film. The blue of the first slide may still be there, but from the standpoint of this new perspective, that blue is now hidden amid its new context. But is the full colour image a more accurate reflection of reality than the monochromatic image? This was our original question. Which nervous system gains its owner access to the most reality? Is there such a perspective? And if so, would it be the holographic collective we have just described? It may seem intuitive to think that a full colour image reflects reality to a higher degree than a monochromatic image. However, for this to be true in an absolute sense, the spectrum of electromagnetic waves would need to be bookended by an absolute frequency range. Now, this distinction between absolute and relative is going to be a crucial one for us to wrap our heads around. So let's just take a moment so I can explain what I mean. It is well known that light is bound by the unambiguous frequency range called the visible light spectrum. But just like the geometric bounty found by the alien amid the infinite sands, this range only retains its unambiguous status so long as it's considered relative to us and our perspective. In a sense, this is obvious. A visible spectrum can only ever be that which is visible to us. But it's not just that frequencies stretch off into the infrared, ultraviolet, and beyond, but also because the frequencies themselves shift relative to our movement. Still, there must be some absolute physical limit that we can use to define the bounds of the electromagnetic spectrum, some highest or lowest frequency. Let's start with the lower frequencies. Though we may not know the current size of the universe, it's clear that any supposed lowest or widest frequency could only ever be as wide or as old as the universe itself, a clear limiting feature. But assuming that the universe continues to age and grow, it's thought that electromagnetic frequencies could, theoretically, continue expanding with the universe towards infinity, only reaching zero energy once an infinite distance or age has been achieved. So again, this is only a relative boundary. But what about the other end of the spectrum? Is there a smallest or highest frequency? According to Maxwell's equations, there is no upper limit to the range of electromagnetic frequencies. However, the practical implications of such an energy increase would be more than a little devastating. For starters, if any object is ever compressed within its Schwarzschild radius, it forms a black hole, another apparent limiting feature. We don't know if this rule applies to the massless photon, as its Schwarzschild radius is equal to the Planck length, and so would be within the domain of quantum uncertainty. But as it is a theoretical possibility, let us ask, would this be the absolute boundary of the spectrum? Just as ice can turn to water, and water can turn to steam, the birth of a black hole is only what we call a phase transition, where nothing other than the relationships and their emergent characteristics change. Physically, it's still the same thing, manifesting differently relative to its new environmental conditions. So a relative boundary. Even if we go on increasing the energy, it's thought that it would only lead to further phase transitions, leading to the remerging of the electromagnetic field itself, with the weak nuclear force essentially reversing the events that took place shortly after the Big Bang. But the point is always the same, that each transition is simply the label that we attribute to a relatively significant stage of the process. As such, these are all relative boundaries. Though that doesn't mean that they are false or illusion, just that the line in the sand is in a sense arbitrary and so not absolute. The class of absolute boundary is not yet such that we have ever encountered. So with all that in mind, though it may seem intuitive that the full colour image reflects reality to a higher degree than the monochromatic image, the actuality is that each is of equal relative validity, since the hierarchy between these subsegments only remains relevant so long as we consider them from within some broader abstracted relative frame. If there is no absolute highest or lowest frequency, it is therefore true that any finite subsegment will be as close to the totality as any other. Irrespective of size or complexity, no finite structure will ever reach any closer towards an infinite. But as just said, this does not deny their relative existence. Indeed, it does exactly the opposite. It justifies their identity. Since in an infinitely relativistic system, every slice of the spectrum always appreciates something that another does not. Rather than building a tower of complexity that endlessly reaches towards some absolute totality, each finite framing is always a relative totality in and of itself. And this brings us back to consciousness and the nervous system, as this is why, at the end of the last chapter, we stated that the nervous system cannot be considered a reliably consistent structure. Its ability to know reality is relative, as it is only an abstracted subsegment of an otherwise continuous spectrum, especially when we remember that the nervous system's talent for awareness was only a derivative of interaction and touch, a phase transition, if you will. But this also highlights our second takeaway from the previous chapter. In parallel with our earlier discussions regarding the chicken and the egg, the boundaries of living and non-living matter, the nervous system does not offer us any sign of natural boundary, no light bulb moments, no digital on-off points that we could attribute a first conscious awakening. Just as both the creature within the infinite desert, or the impossible perceiver within the holographic totality, both failed to close in on a totality of truth. So does the nervous system only provide us with a continuation of variety, an endless stream of unique perspectives, no more or less valid than any other subsegment of the continuum. So what have we learnt? The problem we had with our first definition of consciousness was that we declared it must be considered a phenomenon that either is or isn't. Whereas intelligence required a language of hierarchical complexity, consciousness was a totality, a whole phenomenon in and of itself. Indeed, it was the linguistic boundary that we offered in our attempt at differentiating consciousness from intelligence, grammatically likening it to terms such as alive rather than intelligent, as in nothing can ever be more or less alive, whereas it can be more or less intelligent. But of course, we had already dissected the theorized boundaries of life in those earlier chapters and found none. Likewise, the evolutionary fluidity of the nervous system has again produced no hard boundaries. Instead, all we see is an ever-growing palette of senses, each emerging from the darkness through yet another never-ending process of interaction and complexification. Just as in the description of life, beginning with a cell, it is we who have described the boundary and hence created it. And so it appears that we can verbally define consciousness as a totality, but this, like the word alive, will only ever be that, a verbal definition, a subjective framing. Here we should take stock and try to recognize that just as our physical selves could be considered one with the physical universe, so must our consciousness be of this same totality. Now I know that some will feel that we've just jumped off the hippy-dippy deep end, as too will there be others who would put it that we've only just stumbled upon the first primal truth. But to both, I put it to you that any boundary you wish to entertain, be that in terms of matter or mind, will always, given enough time and perseverance, reveal itself as nothing more than a shifting of perspectives. As an ocean wave emerges from the water molecules, so does a living consciousness emerge from the greater universe, for these are not two separate realities, as one René Descartes would have us believe. As put, experience can only exist due to some interaction. But any physical interaction can only ever reveal its discrete physical form when being experienced. The dog is chasing its own tail. And so, if there are no hard boundaries, but only shifting perspectives, can we propose a totality of any phenomenon, let alone consciousness? As to our topic of consciousness, we can, of course, follow it to the ends of its described borders, and quite satisfactorily indicate where we begin to see a reasonable point of difference, say between a rock and a person. But in actuality, how clear is that boundary? How definite, how absolute? Most people agree that plants and fungi are, though alive, not technically conscious. After all, they have no nervous system and thus feel no pain or pleasure. But they do show behaviour and, in many cases, even intelligence. Due to this, I consider their role in the story of consciousness as fantastically intriguing, and would consider them the perfect candidate to help us further dissect these shrouded boundaries between conscious and non-conscious reality.